I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: what could Star Wars learn from Mission Impossible? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because a couple of days ago I was sitting in an airport waiting for my flight home, and I began to think to myself about the brand new Disney Star Wars, and the thought that was on my mind as I was sitting there was, how did they manage to stuff this up so badly? How did they manage to make such a mess of this much beloved and hugely popular cinematic franchise? They were handed a golden goose here. They were handed something that had a hugely devoted fan base, that was hugely popular, and the fan base were crying out for more of that Star Wars magic, and they still managed to make an absolute mess of this. Really, I think the thing that brought Star Wars to its knees was The Last Jedi. I think anyone who's fair and who's balanced, you don't have to go into extremes or lunacy or insults or anything to recognise that this film really did bring Star Wars to its knees, and it's done a lot of damage. And so much of it, I think, is about the fact that it's just a very grey and bland and hollow, heartless version of what Star Wars once was. It's got a whole lot of the chess pieces on the board, but the heart and the soul is just not there. I was thinking back to the prequels as well the other day, and I was thinking even they didn't make that mistake. The prequels, artistically, there are problems, and it's really around the story and the construction of the story and characters and things like that. It's lacking. It's not good. But there's still that Star Wars magic, that Star Wars heart and soul is still there. You can watch those films and you are still immersed in the magic and the world and everything of Star Wars, even if artistically and storytelling-wise there are some big problems here. But The Last Jedi, it's just bland. It's missing the magic. The Star Wars magic is not there, and I think a big part of that was what they did to Luke Skywalker. They gutted that character and reduced him to a cynical, bland shell of what the old character was, and there's no doubt that that had a huge impact on what this movie actually was. It could have been a lot different if they hadn't treated that character in that way. Interestingly enough, I think the prequels and The Last Jedi both suffer from the same major flaw. In the prequels, George Lucas had far too much creative control. There weren't people keeping the excesses in check, and it seems to me, based on everything I've read and heard about The Last Jedi, that Rian Johnson had far too much creative control in that scenario, and there was no one there to put the brakes on where the brakes should have been put on, and to keep those creative excesses that end up in really bad and awful places in check. And so both of these things suffer from the same problem, yet the prequels still have that heart and soul there. And as I was sitting there in that airport pondering these points, I began to think to myself, well, is this just a sign, or is this just proof that a franchise is basically doomed to failure? That there's like a pinnacle moment that every franchise has where it reaches its high point, usually very early on, and then it just begins to degrade from there, and the quality in what you're producing just gets worse. And the longer it goes, the worse it gets. Well, no, that's actually not true. Now, initially I thought maybe that was the case, but then I began to think a bit more, and I thought, hold on a minute, what about Mission Impossible? The Mission Impossible franchise proves that theory is not true, because the Mission Impossible franchise, if you look at it and you go back to the very beginning, we're up to the 6th film now in that franchise, but you go back to the very beginning, and what you've got originally, that original film, which I remember going to see that in cinemas, and this was a film that was effectively a reboot of a decades-old TV show. And the original film was a little bit campy. It was sort of, I guess, a toned-down, more light-hearted version of a James Bond type film with a team of spies instead of just one person. And then the second film came out, and the second film I think is the worst film in the franchise. If you go back now and watch that, it has not aged well at all. It's not a particularly good film. So interestingly enough, the beginnings of this franchise weren't the greatest at all. And then comes the third film, and in the third film there's something new going on here. There's a bit of a change in direction that's starting to happen. And then comes Ghost Protocol, and Ghost Protocol is a really good film. So what you have now is a franchise that's on its 4th film, but far from degrading and going backwards, they're now actually on an upward trajectory. They're climbing. But was it all a fluke? Well, we then get Rogue Nation, and Rogue Nation proves, no, it wasn't a fluke, because Rogue Nation is even better than Ghost Protocol. In fact, Rogue Nation, I think, was a slightly better film than the Bond film that was released that same year. So this is this franchise now that's really climbing. And then, of course, we have the latest installment, Mission Impossible Fallout. Now, it's debatable, is it better than Rogue Nation? You could debate that, I think, but there's no doubt it's on a par with Rogue Nation. It is not degraded. The franchise is now not on a downhill trend again. This is a franchise that is still trending upwards. And what's the difference here? What is it about Mission Impossible that these other franchises could learn from? Well, first of all, Mission Impossible has not oversaturated the market. They don't have all sorts of spin-offs and TV shows and backstories to back up the main films. They just have these films which are based on a decades-old TV show. Secondly, they take their time. They are not churning out a film every year. They have a couple of years between each movie. Now that's important because it gives you the time to actually have a good creative process involved in the writing and the production and the putting together, the filming, the shooting, the creation of this film. Thirdly, there is an artistic commitment in these films. And in particular, I'm thinking here about Tom Cruise's almost obsessive compulsive desire that as many of the stunts as possible be actually shot as real as they possibly can be with him actually doing the stunt work. Now, as we can see, there's a risk in that, and of course Tom Cruise is not getting any younger, so he can't probably keep doing this forever and a day, but there is something about that where you watch that film and the magic of it. Even my kids, they watch these films and they are caught up by the magic of it. They know that there's a reality here in what they are seeing. Now, obviously, it's orchestrated reality and it's always carefully controlled, but it is still an artistic commitment to actually shoot these stunts with Tom Cruise, not with doubles, to actually do as much as you can in camera rather than CGI tricks. And it makes a huge difference. And I think you'll notice that's the difference between sort of the earlier films and what we've got now is sort of a movement away from some of that other stuff to actually more of an artistic commitment to what ends up on screen. And that really gives us, the audience, that extra wow factor. And of course, and probably most importantly of it all, is the commitment to good storytelling. These films tell engaging and interesting stories. Now, okay, they are espionage thrillers, and at times they can get a little bit convoluted, who's betraying who and who's who, because it seems that every 5 minutes there's some new character or organisation or important plot point that's introduced, but they're not that hard to follow, and they are good and enjoyable stories. You actually go along and have a great bit of fun. In fact, Mission Impossible, I would suggest, is now actually competing alongside James Bond. They started out as what you might call a campy, light-hearted imitation of what Bond was. They are now on a footing with James Bond, and I don't just mean the old campy James Bond, I mean the new, holy moly, Daniel Craig, this James Bond is so amazing, James Bond. They are actively footing it. Like I said, I actually think that Rogue Nation was a better film than the Bond film that came out that same year. And that's saying something. So they are living proof that a franchise can actually maintain a consistent level of quality. But you've actually got to commit yourself to that. It doesn't happen by chance, and it doesn't happen by oversaturating the market and rushing things and not thinking through the creative process at all. Those things you can see that are going wrong with Star Wars right now are very much driven, probably primarily by just a total oversaturation, but also a lack of careful and well thought out creative control about what is actually being churned out here, the type of movies and other content that are being released as part of the Star Wars canon. The one thing I will say is, in regards to Mission Impossible, I'm now really keen for Christopher Nolan to actually direct a Mission Impossible film. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but I think you'd probably agree with me that that would be quite an enjoyable film to watch. The other thing I'll say is I don't know how long Mission Impossible can keep this up because of the fact that Tom Cruise isn't getting any younger, and he is very much the cornerstone, the linchpin of that franchise. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. It seems to me that they are sort of positioning themselves to possibly move him into the role of being the director rather than Ethan Hunt on the front lines. So we'll sort of see how this all plays out and whether they can keep this sort of momentum up. But the simple fact is, up until this point, they have actually proved that you can produce a franchise and you can have a good franchise that has longevity and is producing good and enjoyable movies that people actually want to watch. And not only that, but they're actually getting better with each installment. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.